What is up, everybody? Another episode of From My High Horse. In this one, we're going to talk about CRT. So, what is CRT? So, there are two abbreviations that kind of go hand in hand. They basically mean the same thing, and that's critical race theory. That's kind of the first CRT that ever came up. It's probably the one you'll hear the most about, but you might also hear about people talk about culturally responsive teaching, which is it's CRT. I mean, it's basically the same thing. It's just a rebrand, basically. So, let's talk about it. So, first of all, I just want to say that it doesn't help that proponents and critics have widely different definitions of CRT. It makes it very hard to have a meaningful discussion when people have different definitions of what they are discussing. So, Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, who is credited for coining the term CRT, critical race theory, she puts it like this. CRT is more of a verb than a noun. It is a way of seeing, attending to, accounting for, tracing, and analyzing the ways that race is produced, she said. And the other thing she says was the ways that racial inequality is facilitated and the ways that our history has created these inequalities that now can almost effortlessly be reproduced unless we attend to the existence of these inequalities. So pretty loaded definition there. Let's look at someone who's against CRT. Let's see how they would define it. So going with some writings here from Chris Rufo, who's one of the biggest anti-CRT people, and he would define CRT as an academic discipline built on the intellectual framework of identity-based Marxism. So that's a bit loaded there. Let's keep going so we don't get bogged down though. To simplify things based on those two definitions that we both got, what I came up with was CRT is a way to look at anything in a society while questioning how people of different races or ethnicities have been affected or will be affected in the past, present, future, with the goal of improving negative outcomes. Now, I added the goal of improving negative outcomes as part of the definition because that seems to be a very core principle of CRT, no matter what side is looking at it. So, let's just quickly go over what CRT is not. So, I did see a couple of people trying to say that CRT was inherently anti-white during my research, but honestly, it does not seem to be anti-white or actually anti any specific race, although one could say that it is and it is sometimes and has been used as a weapon for anti-white sentiment and propaganda in the past. I will say, though, that these principles that can be weaponized can be used against any race. It doesn't have to be white people in particular. Now let's talk about some of the issues that CRT is kind of bringing up, and let's go from there. So let's now talk about what CRT actually is. So arguments from critics is that CRT is inherently racist due to the fact that it creates a racial caste system and views minorities as oppressed and in need of extra help or handouts, instead of seeing all individuals as equals and judging them on basis of merits. The critics of CRT argue that what CRT teaches will not actually help fix any of the problems and disparities that minorities face, and that teaching CRT might actually make racial relations worse. So the argument from the proponents is that historical and systemic mistreatment of minorities throughout history has created injustices for people of color that persist into the modern day, and in order to fix these things we need to focus more on equity instead of just equality. The proponents, the people who like CRT, are definitely correct to point out that there are past issues that persist today that minorities have to deal with, but the real heart of the argument and the disagreement lies in the praxis or the proposed solutions and the goals of CRT. So Basically, after doing a lot of research, it seems like equity versus equality is basically at the heart of this argument. Equality of outcome is equity, whereas equal opportunity is equality. Those on the critical side of CRT who are against it are correct to point out that the concept of equity in this sense is based on an aspect of Marxist communism and probably rooted, or at the very least inspired, or has some kind of imprint on critical race theory coming from critical theory and Marxism. Critical theory basically was invented by Marxism, and it's one of the tenets. Proponents for CRT are correct in pointing out that meritocracy is intertwined with the concept of capitalism by definition, since they are both systems in which advancement is based on individual ability or achievement. So one question is, where do the ideas of CRT actually lead? Arguably, things that exist today, such as affirmative action policies and racial quotas for hiring, could be considered aspects of CRT in the real world. However, there are new examples of segregation in colleges, such as black affinity housing, where they basically it's segregation. And there's also racial affinity groups, which are groups that meet and they're all the same race. And on face value, these racial affinity groups may seem like a great idea, but how about when white affinity groups or white-only housing start to become more prominent? It's kind of easy to see where these ideas can possibly lead to horrifying consequences. As far as solutions go, I think an important starting point for both sides to come together would be to simply teach history with all the possible historical context and nuance to allow discussions to flourish from there. For example, black history in American textbooks should not begin with black people as slaves, because obviously Africans and other minorities have a rich culture and history of their own. Whitewashing history to include only the good parts, like some on the right have argued, will eventually lead to distrust, animosity, aggression when individuals learn the history in the full context. But at the same time, focusing too much on past injustices may also lead to some kind of distrust, animosity, and aggression. It's kind of how if you've had an ex-girlfriend that constantly brings up something bad you did in the past. At a certain point, dwelling too much on the past can prevent those in a relationship from being able to move forward. Vicky? Okay, so by that logic, individuals are right to criticize the goals and perceived outcomes of teaching CRT to children. The goals of CRT can arguably seem to go against what the great Martin Luther King Jr. said about his children being judged on their character and not the color of their skin. Some minorities find the concept of CRT belittling and have called CRT and its proponents racists with a guilty conscience. Some argue that teaching about a hierarchical society where whites are on top and blacks are on the bottom will further perpetuate the problem and increase division. It also isn't well known what it might do to children to have them hyper-focused on race from a young age. Now, one question that needs to be asked is, do black people generally support CRT? There is a little bit of data on this coming from a 1,500 person YouGov study. Yeah, that is a very small study, by the way. 1,500 people is not that great, but it's from June of 2021. And here's an excerpt from Yahoo News. When asked if they thought critical race theory was good or bad for America, 55% of respondents said that the theory was bad for America, compared to 37% who said it was good. So most people in general thought it was bad, but black Americans were more likely to indicate that they thought critical race theory was good for the country, with 75% indicating it was good compared to 18% who said it was bad. What this says to me is that there may be some concerns or gaps in the conversation about CRT that both critics and proponents need to address so that everyone here can move forward. Ultimately, I don't think there's a whole lot that parents can actually do to prevent CRT from being taught to their children. No legislation can truly prevent educators from teaching CRT to children, simply due to the fact that educators will find a way around any laws by changing definitions or characteristics of what they teach and practice. While it is true that public school teachers do not technically have free speech in regards to teaching due to being government employees, I fear very little can be done to prevent these ideas from being taught to youth. Though something like cameras in classrooms could be a solution, it would take a lot of manpower to observe so many classrooms for so much time. Maybe that's something parents are willing to do. We'll have to see. I will say, while speaking out and talking to people is important, I think that those who are against CRT being taught in schools should at the very least, be having long and fruitful discussions with your own children about what they're learning in school regarding race. Definitely get involved in your local school board. That's always a good place to start. If you're really against the way things are being taught in the schools in your area and there's really nothing you can do about it, then some form of alternative schooling might be in order, and probably is a good idea anyway. Something like homeschooling or pod learning or private school or just anything else. My big takeaway from studying all this is that regular people need to start actually talking about this stuff, but in order to do so, ideas need to first be well defined. I can't tell you how many websites or debates I listen to where people couldn't agree on the definition of CRT, and if there was a definition, it would be like 3 to 6 paragraphs long. It's impossible to debate a topic if the people participating in the debate don't agree on the definition of the idea at hand. So that's why I made this video. I felt like this should have been something super easy, super quick, super simple, but it's actually way more complicated, kind of like everything else in the world. Well, and that's about it. Get the hell out of here now.